But there does seem to be some evidence of a divided approach to security issues. Not only that, but the security forces themselves seem to be divided. So Jason Burke's articles in The Guardian about police giving him documents pointing to the army is not just an inter-service rivalry, but I think it's probably a true reflection of divisions down there. So I think there are two questions emanating from your question about the response of the security forces. And that is A, over the top, certainly. B, a divided response. I should make one further comment about technique, and that this is not an undisciplined response. What you've got down there is a very, very honed methodology, which relies on not killing everybody. Okay. In other words, beating someone to within an inch of his life or her life, and letting them survive so they've got tales of terror to tell other people, relatives, friends, extended family, that kind of thing, has a multiplier effect of some dimension. And so I think a very great deal of this is not just suppressing the unrest at this moment in time, but sending out warnings that there should not be unrest in the future.
Professor Alexander.
Again, thank you very much for the invitation to appear here. Yes, I would very much agree with what Professor Chan has said, that the response has shown some divisions within the security forces and perhaps also within the ruling party. There is an endless rumor mill about this, which is reflected in the media here and in Zimbabwe and on all forms of social media. But I think there are attempts to kind of simplify those divisions into a Chiwenga versus Mnangagwa scenario or something like that, or the divisions between the police and the army, but I think they're actually much more complex and intractable than that. So within the military you have elite units which are in a very different position to the rank and file soldier. Within the police you have the law and order unit, you have the traffic police, you have the riot police. They all have different grievances and different agendas. You have tensions between the two intelligence services, the military intelligence and the CIO. Running through all of those divisions, you have allegiances to different factions within the ruling party. So to try to simplify those kinds of divisions is extremely difficult, and to a certain extent it's a black box. So we kind of fly unguided when we try to analyze those kinds of divisions, but they are important, and to some extent they're a reflection of the working out of the relationships that were established during the coup, and that had actually a destabilizing effect because it undermined what were quite clear relations between the party and the military. It undermined certain kinds of hierarchies within the party. It's now possible for things to happen that couldn't have happened before the coup. So I think that's another factor, and some of those relationships are still, being negotiated. So that's a factor behind this. But I mean, to actually get to your question about the government's response, I mean, as Stephen has said, it was extremely heavy-handed, and it went from a kind of, there was some concerns with law and order and controlling looting on the part of riot police, but it quickly turned into a program of collective punishment. That spread throughout the townships on a really massive scale and is ongoing. Many people are still in hiding and haven't had proper medical care. So that's something which obviously requires urgent attention, and providing aid and providing succor to people in this context is incredibly important.
Thank you very much indeed. Paul.
Thank you very much. Stephen, listen to what Jocelyn was saying about Mnangagwa and his relationship with the army, about the difficulties of simplifying it. I wonder if you could comment, if you think that's right, about what his relationship with the army is. There's been reports that there may be a coup with the army, and what your thoughts are within that.
Well, I think certainly the South Africans have sent up signals that a coup is not going to be tolerated. And they hold a number of liquidity keys, of course, that Zimbabwe needs. So I wouldn't foresee a coup at any moment in the near future. I think Jocelyn is quite right that the security forces are severely divided. And you do have some elite units, probably in this case those who were very much involved in the apex of the suppression of the recent riots and difficulties. probably trying to disguise themselves in non-regimental uniform, as it were. But the exact plurality of the security forces is something that we can't itemize in any exact degree. I think it is fair to say that the President does face a divided security network, of which he's not fully in control. The President seems not to be fully in control of a whole range of issues. The fact that he left the country after the announcement of the huge rise in the price of oil, petroleum product, does indicate he's not particularly in touch with the reality of citizens' lives. So that the violence broke out and it was responded to in his absence. That does point to some kind of culpability on the part of the acting president. Now, how much the acting president is himself in charge of all sectors of the security forces, that again is a very, very open question. And certainly I think the police think that the response has been over the top. The intelligence service is certainly divided, and not just between military intelligence and civilian intelligence. I think there are factions within those as well. Coming to grips with all of this is, I think, going to be a monumental task. It's not for us to diagnose how to do that, but it does indicate the sheer complexity of the Zimbabwean situation when you look at it.
Yeah, thank you.
Economic reforms, which include severe austerity measures, do you think they're destabilising the country and potentially undermining the prospects of political democratisation rather than enhancing them? I don't know who would like to comment on austerity measures and
Whether austerity measures are going to contribute to political stability, is that your question? I think implementing austerity measures in the current context in Zimbabwe, with a huge deficit of political legitimacy on the part of the government and extraordinary suffering among the populace, is incredibly difficult to do and probably can't be done without an authoritarian element to it. These protests, which started on January 14 on the back of the doubling of the fuel prices, that was the spark. But the conditions under which people have been living for this past year have deteriorated and created incredible hardships in a whole range of ways, in terms of people being able to afford to send their children to school, in terms of people being able to afford transportation. Basic purchasing of food has become incredibly difficult for people as the price of bread and meal has gone up and up and up again. And if you're going to say this government should take all of its the foreign currency which it earns and put that to paying back arrears, rather than to investing, say, in productive ways in the economy or creating some kind of social safety net, I think that's bound to cause political instability.
Yes, if I could just add a rider to that. The Minister of Finance's relatively recent budget, for instance, contained almost nothing that we would recognize as genuine incentives for productivity. And insofar as he was dealing with implementing measures of austerity, it seemed to be a budget that was a patch and mend one. There's no planning capacity beyond austerity, but I agree completely with Jocelyn. I'm getting significant reports in the rural areas, for instance, where young women can't afford sanitary products. Speaking about the budget, the Minister of Finance reduced the tax on sanitary products. That barely addressed the issue because they're simply not available, whether they're taxed or not. So I agree completely that if we take a hard line and reduce the inflow of liquidity to the country, the people who will suffer are not those who make governmental decisions. It's going to be those very, very poor people, including, I have a particular interest in a number of projects involving young women. They're going to be very, very much affected in the rural areas.
I could add just two things to that. One is the imminence of a very severe drought, which is going to severely undermine people's livelihoods and cause real hunger. That's going to develop in the coming several months. I think already the FAO is saying something like 2.4 million people will need food aid in the next month. And I think on the back of these protests also there is, again, this kind of contradictions in economic policy developing, because on the one hand you have the Minister of Finance writing in the state-run Herald newspaper about the need to cut back on parastatals and become more efficient. At virtually the same time, you have the Vice President giving a speech in which he said we need to create new parastatals to run a bus company, to run a national network of pharmacies, and we need to control prices of basic commodities to make sure they're affordable. All of this will require massive state intervention and subsidies, i.e. it's the exact opposite of what the Minister of Finance is promising. So I think that there's just, but obviously that is about solving a political problem that they're facing rather than the economic problem. And I can see those tensions growing in the coming months as the drought, among other things, bites.
Professor Chang, could you say a little bit more about, you said projects for young women in rural areas that might be particularly a threat. Could you say a little bit more about what that would be?
A huge number of non-governmental organizations that operate in Zimbabwe and in the surrounding area. And they've taken almost as a mantra, and I think a very desirable mantra, that they want to have a specific target audience of young women, particularly young women completing education and getting from primary school to secondary school. There's a major blockage in terms of that transition. Yeah. And then allowing them to complete secondary school. Now that's at precisely the age where all kinds of, as it were, physical changes occur. Thus the need for sanitary products, for instance. All kinds of issues to do with harassment, sexual harassment, that kind of thing. And so the non-governmental organizations that I've been working with have been trying to guarantee as far as possible that transition from primary to secondary school. But also I'm involved in unusual projects of teaching these young women self-defense so that if they're harassed precisely by predators, they've got at least some limited but real capacity to resist. So you'll find variations of certainly educational projects of transitioning and completing secondary education throughout many parts of rural Zimbabwe. What these young women will go on to, and the young men, for instance, very few of them can go on to higher education or even technical further education. And even if they do, then of course you've got this terrible employment problem. There's nothing for them to do when they come out. So what you have is the makings of a most literate, youthful population, perfect grammar that would put many of our school students to shame. But there will be nothing for them. They'll be the net victims of the powerless nature of the current regime.
We should add that today teachers went on strike. And it's interesting if you read the list of grievances which they put forward to justify going on strike. And the word that they used that struck me was incapacitation. And by incapacitation, they mean they can't afford to work. They can't afford to get to work. They can't afford to feed their families on their salaries. They don't have the basic supplies in schools. I mean, it is incredibly important to support young women in schools, but what the schools themselves are able to teach now is hugely constrained. And one of the things that was happening in January was the opening of the school year. And at that moment, the price of a school uniform was $140. That was absolutely prohibitive to many, many families. So even getting people into schools now, much less keeping them in schools, paying school fees, paying all of the things which are now charged to parents in terms of provisioning students, is incredibly difficult. I mean, that's an area where donor support is incredibly important. And I'd say the second one would be also in the field of medicine. And I think my colleague, Professor Chigudu, could speak to that question. But I think in both cases, in the medical and the educational spheres, you have an incredibly rich sort of network of professionals and talented people who are dying to do their job. I mean, they really would like to work in hospitals and work in schools, and they simply aren't able to in a way that can maintain their very dignity at the moment. And donors can do a great deal to kind of support that.
Thank you very much indeed. If I can welcome Professor Chigudu. We've covered a couple of areas, but we've got plenty more questions to come. And what I'll do is I'll pass to my colleague Chris for the next question, but do feel free when you first answer a question to give a little bit of an introduction. Chris.
I was wondering if donors such as the UK, were they too quick to back the president or not quick enough in hindsight?
Professor Chigudi, do you want to
Well, first let me apologise for arriving a few minutes late. I had a bit of a transport nightmare trying to get here from Cambridge. So my name is Simukai Chigudu. I teach with Professor Alexander at Oxford in the Department of International Development. So the question as to whether the donor community, the international community, was either too quick or too slow to back President Mnangagwa is, of course, a politically fraught and challenging one. I think that interpreting the Zimbabwe situation has to have a systemic analysis. This is deeper than individuals. It's about trying to understand the makings of the crisis that has gripped the country, particularly since the late 1990s and 2000s to the present moment. And I think within that context, one needs to look at not only former President Robert Mugabe, but the group of people that was governing the country and the decisions that were taken, particularly when faced with an opposition, to assert their control, not only of the economy, but to remain in political power. And I think in many ways, President Mnangagwa has been part of this machinery for a very long time. So perhaps better way of kind of thinking about this is trying to understand some of the inner workings of the government, of the ruling party, and tracing the history of President Mnangagwa's own involvement in various episodes of Zimbabwe's political history. So I certainly think that this immediate period cannot be seen in isolation, and I think that it was perhaps short-sighted and optimistic to hope that changing of the guard by the figure of the president would be the decisive moment in reshaping the trajectory of the country's politics.
I mean, there was a prior politics in which all of Zimbabwe's woes were laid at the doorstep of Robert Mugabe, and that was very oversimplifying to see it that way. ZANU-PF is a sophisticated system of government. It doesn't rest on the back of one person. So to see that shift in just the presidential office as offering some kind of fresh start, I think was naive. And certainly many people in Zimbabwe were deeply disheartened by the rapidity with which that regime was embraced, when in fact it was made very clear shortly after the change that this was interpreted by ZANU-PF itself, as it said explicitly. Patrick Chinamosa, I think, said it within days, that this was an internal ZANU-PF matter. In fact, it was the outcome of a succession struggle. It wasn't some sort of great reformist urge.
Yeah. Sorry, I would just very briefly add that I think in the euphoria of November 2017, the kind of flooding of the streets of people, the popular protests and so forth, gave a slightly misleading picture as to what was happening. I think that there was a moment of social catharsis, if you will, as people were relieved to see the politics changing somewhat, or at least to see the president being removed. But I think that that shouldn't blind us to the issues that Professor Alexander is raising, that this was really an elite conflict.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. At the same time, I advised Rory Stewart when he was the Minister for Africa to go to Zimbabwe and helped him write a speech which he gave when he landed in Zimbabwe. I thought it was right at least to give some indication, even at the level of a junior minister, that we were prepared to discuss the future in a conditional way. I think what we did not do in the wake of the change of leadership of President, we did not, as it were, muster as an international coalition, for want of another word, that would together have read a riot act as to the kinds of structural, particularly economic, as well as social and political reforms that were desirable. One junior minister saying a few things about we'll be prepared to cooperate in the future if doesn't carry much weight, but if a very great number of senior people from very, very important governments say that these are the things that must be done, then I think they would have had more weight. So I think that we missed a chance there to influence events by failing to muster an international alliance or coalition, whatever, including other southern African countries, particularly South Africa, for instance.
Chris.
That's quite helpful, actually, because it leads on to what I want to ask next, because EU sanctions are due to be renewed. There's a decision coming up this month. Should the UK government back that? And should they be strengthened or indeed targeted?
Who'd like to lead on that one? Sanctions.
I don't think sanctions have done any good whatsoever. And I think that the keeping in particular of US residual sanctions has not helped the matter. I would be very much for the lifting of sanctions simply as a goodwill gesture, given their the lack of efficacy in any case. But very, very much I would be continuing my previous theme in the business of saying any future cooperation and any future inflow of significant liquidity to help their balance of payment problems and things of that sort is going to have to be heavily conditional. So that kind of thing, I think, will have far more stick to it than things to do with sanctions.
Any disagreement on that point, lifting
I would
sanctions?
just say that sanctions has been a very useful stick for ZNPF to beat the opposition
Right,
with,
okay.
for many years now. And I think members of civic movements have pointed that out for a long time, that the actual effects of the sanctions pale against their utility politically for ZNPF to maintain a position of victimization by the West.
Yeah, and just briefly to reinforce the point that both my colleagues have made here, an important kind of rhetorical move that's often made on the part of the ruling party is to insist that all of its opposition, as well as civil society and NGOs, are part of a nefarious regime change agenda. And sanctions lends heavy credence to that cause and further fuels the polarization within the country. So in addition to the, as has been said, in addition to the lack of efficacy, there is this powerful political work that's being done under the guise of sanctions that's actually reinforcing some of the more toxic politics in the country. So I similarly share in hesitation about advocating sanctions.
And does that apply across the board? I think Chris distinguished the current sanctions from ones that might be more targeted at regime individuals. Are you saying even those sorts of sanctions have that counterproductive effect?
I mean, they certainly do politically and rhetorically. Now, trying to evaluate their actual economic effect is a different matter.
Right.
And perhaps one of my colleagues might speak to that. But rhetorically, I don't think that targeted or otherwise, I mean, if you go through a series of government edicts, media communications, and so forth, they will even invoke the idea that sanctions are targeted as camouflage. They'll say that they say it's targeted, but it doesn't really make a difference. Right. This is still to blame for the fundamental economic crisis in the country and the livelihood poverty that people are experiencing. You know, so it will still be used in that way.
It's also used extensively throughout the region. So
yeah.
One of the first things, you know, the ANC says in the aftermath of this conflagration is that sanctions need to be lifted.
Right.
You know, it's just a useful tool rhetorically, and to remove that utility would be very difficult and still to maintain some sanctions.
What is the MDC's view on sanctions?
I'm not sure what their view is right now. they may not have a coherent view.
I don't think there is a coherent view.
I don't know.
We're not certain of a coherent view coming out of the MDC on this issue and a number of issues. I mean, I think that one of the things that is very disturbing about the situation in Zimbabwe right now is the cleavage within the opposition.
Right.
Reflected in terms of the election results, for instance, no matter how obscure they might be, but the fact that the MDC as a parliamentary body seemed to be much more unpopular than the presidential candidate.
Right, yeah.
It does seem to indicate some differences of perception about the worthwhileness, the efficacy, the promise for the future of the MDC. I think in the wake of the death of Morgan Tsvangirai, that party has not yet completed its reinvention of itself.
Right, thank you. Chris, did you?
No, that was fine.
Nigel.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, we were all relieved when Robert Mugabe was kicked out. But with President Mnangagwa, looking at what's happening now in Zimbabwe, it just looks appalling. It seems to be just a continuation. Is your estimation that the president is exactly the same as Mugabe, better than Mugabe, or worse than Mugabe?
In fact, just one of you to answer that. fancies that. I'll give Professor Chikudu the chance to answer that one.
I mean, I guess I would sort of challenge framing the question in that way. I think it really is about trying to understand a system, and one that's quite deep, that runs through not only the ruling party, but how state institutions have been transformed, particularly, as I said, since the post-2000 crisis. None of this, as I said, is down to an individual. There are various ways in which the military is a part of this. There are various ways in which practices of patronage and corruption of state institutions have been taking place for a long time. There are various structural ways in which political kind of pluralism and protest has been shut down and so forth. So I think that there is a sense of continuity in terms of something systemic. But pitting the two men against each other belies that complexity.
Is there any hope there? Any hope for the future in Zimbabwe, or is it just going to continue?
As a Zimbabwean, I couldn't possibly bring myself to say that there is no hope. I think that for some of the issues that Professor Alexander mentioned, particularly in respect to the robustness of human capacity on the country, in key sectors, education and healthcare amongst them, a growing rise of new forms of civil and social formation, even though those are being repressed at the moment, that shows there remains energy and creativity within the country, as well as a commitment and desire to restore this. I think that so long as elite political conflicts play themselves out in this way, we're somewhat stuck. But I don't think that is fixed for good. I think it would be too dim and too dismissive to lose hope of what exists more popularly within the country.
Virendra.
Zimbabwe's efforts to get onto the IMF program, UK has supported it so that they can start clearing the debts on international financial institutions, also to the World Bank and the African Development Bank. Britain fully supported it. How credible is this as a solution to the Zimbabwe's debt problems?
I think that the discussions with the IMF have not made as much progress as they should. And of course, what you've got now is the acting to a very discernible degree in concert between the IMF and institutions like the African Development Bank. Everyone knows that there has to be only one way forward, and that involves some way of being able to repay existing debt and to wean the country away from achieving liquidity simply by continual borrowing, which seems to have been a strategy throughout the last almost 20 years now. The difficulties of engaging with the IMF is precisely the amount of money owed to the IMF, and the IMF having instigated some years ago what they call the Lima program for the repayment of these debts. That Lima program has not been adhered to by the Zimbabwean government. In some ways it was impossible for them to adhere to it, but I don't think they've actually exhibited good faith in even trying to adhere to it. So in terms of my earlier discussion about international coalitions, I think that yes, we need to support the IMF and we need to support the African Development Bank. I would like to see the Chinese declare their hand and actually also support that. The Chinese have been very reticent in terms of making liquidity available to Zimbabwe of the sort that the Zimbabweans need to stabilize the economy, not wanting to throw good money after bad. So if they could be recruited to an international outreach to say, look, repayment of debt, or at least rescheduling and rolling over of debt is critically important, and a responsible attitude towards fiscal affairs is critically important, and incentives for productivity is completely important, then I think that these things make sense. Using the IMF simply as a means of battering the economy further is not going to help. There has to be an internationally accepted and supported mix of incentives, promises, and very, very harsh punishment for misdemeanors. Now, you've got a problem here which can compound existing problems, and that any IMF program to restabilize the economy is going to be accompanied by the usual round of IMF measures to put some rigor into public spending, for instance. This will affect precisely the doctors, the teachers, the nurses, who are already feeling incapacitated, unable to work because they can't earn a living working. So the most vulnerable people stand to suffer further as a result of fiscal discipline, which all the same is probably unavoidable. So apart from encouraging a united international approach to fiscal discipline and what to do in terms of negotiations with the IMF, I think we also have to put in a very great deal of effort to ensure that IMF stringency does not greatly disadvantage those already disadvantaged. This would be a new and creative way forward in terms of normal IMF procedures.
Do either of you want to add anything on that?
I mean, I think in a way we're re-entering the territory of the relationship between austerity and political stability. That any kind of extreme austerity program is going to cause political stability because there just isn't that much give in terms of people's livelihoods now. You simply can't cut salaries. One of the only areas of formal employment that still is significant in Zimbabwe is the civil service. If you start hacking away at those jobs, where are people supposed to make their living? We've also just seen, as a consequence of the recent protests, the destruction of a lot of the small businesses and townships. We've also seen the destruction of vending sites throughout Harare. People are living at an incredibly precarious level. And to suggest that further austerity borne by the population at large could be carried out without serious consequences is just fantasy.
Thank you. Richard.
Could I ask you to say a little bit about the land question? The Zimbabwean government offered 99-year leases to some of the remaining white farmers in the country, and they've also said for those that whose land was seized, they'd be willing to pay compensation for property, but not the land itself. And Mnangagwa's then got on to say, things the quote is, land reform is finished and irreversible. I mean, what's your assessment of what's going on? I mean, is it making progress, and what more should the Zimbabwean government do?
I think the extent to which there have been promises of compensation, and I think there was one very high profile filmed by the ZBC incident in which a white farmer re-entered his land and there was ululation and all the rest of it. I think that was just theater, really. I don't think there's any possibility that white farmers will be paid compensation either for improvements or for the land itself. The cost of that has been calculated at some gigantic sum, which is, in this context where you're talking about do we repay our arrears or do we pay teachers, to think you're going to now take a large sum of money and devote it to paying white farmers, I think is again kind of entering the world of fantasy. I don't think that's going to happen. I think when successive governments have said the land reform question is closed, and by that they mean white farmers are not coming back, that is absolutely the case. It's 20 years down the road from when this fast-track resettlement started. In 2005, it was already quite settled and clearly kind of irreversible politically. So I can't see it being reversed in any substantial way. So the point now is that you've got to invest in smallholder farming and contract farming, and in supporting the medium-scale farmers who are productive. Another thing, I think the more significant thing that the government constantly promises is a land audit of some kind to kind of ferret out multiple farm ownership and unproductive farmers. That never actually happens, obviously because the people who would be targeted are politically powerful. So that's, I think that's the level at which you've got to start thinking about this. You've also got to start thinking seriously about how to support smallholder farmers. Unfortunately, in the face of a severe drought, all the, I'm sure you're aware of the kind of command agriculture program which distributes seeds and fertilizers to smallholder farmers. That was rolled out on a huge scale just before the 2018 elections, which was an odd time of year to do it because it was many months before the actual planting season. It obviously was a patronage mechanism. But right now all of that command agriculture seeds and fertilizer is burning up in the sun. So there's got to be more support for smallholders to make good on their farming endeavors, and of course every rise in the price of transportation, every rise in the price of fertilizer, and any imported goods that are used in farming makes the functionality of farming far more difficult.
No, I completely agree with that. I think it's cosmetics. Mnangagwa played a brilliant cosmetic campaign and seeming to appeal to sections of what was left of the white commercial farmers leading up to the election. Their public relations support was important to his election campaign to appear a reasonable person in our eyes, for instance. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't put very much credence in the reality of this beyond one or two public relations moments. Nothing is going to happen. Nothing can happen because there's no money. So they can promise as much as they'd like. There is no money for this, and I think Jocelyn was completely correct. If there were money, it should go to things like education and medicine. And I completely agree, any rebuilding of the agricultural sector does have to pay special attention to small and medium farming efforts. The rebuilding of dams, for instance, precisely as an insurance against moments of drought, is something which we could engage in, but that would require a planned nationwide program. You've got an added difficulty, however, in that because of the meltdown of the commercial farming sector, which is not going to be restored, no matter who owns the commercial farms, it's not going to be restored because the markets they used to command have been seized by other southern African countries who are reliable in the provision of agricultural produce. So even if we were somehow to re-establish a nationwide functioning agricultural sector with agri-industrial capacity as well as benefits for small-scale farmers who are all part of a production chain, that's not necessarily the case that is going to bring prosperity back to the country. The Zambians would have a thing to say about that, for instance. The South Africans would have a thing to say about that, for instance, as with the Mozambicans, who are very, very fast to move into market areas formerly occupied by the Zimbabwean farmers.
And I mean, what do you think the donor community could do on this? I mean, you both mentioned targeting small and medium-sized farmers is actually the way of going, and I think DFID's main programme in relation to agriculture is the Zimbabwe Livelihoods and Food Security Programme. How's that working out, and is there more things that DFID in particular and other donors could do?
Who would like to answer that?
I don't have detailed knowledge of DFID's programs in this regard.
Insofar as I've got scant knowledge, it doesn't include huge capital, as it were, investment in terms of building infrastructure. And it seems to me, I mentioned in passing the issue of dams, for instance. I'm not talking about huge infrastructural projects. I'm talking about small dams dotted around the rural areas. Building of aquifers, for instance, reliable access to underwater, water without draining dry the aquifers, for instance, in key provinces like Osvingo, for instance. You've got a whole range of small infrastructural projects that need to be developed, but which will cost money. And again, I lament the fact there's no international cohesion or cooperation to together undertake such projects. Everyone wants to leave their own little stamp, and there's no big enough stamp actually to revitalize any sector of agriculture in Zimbabwe right now.
Can I finish with a broader question about DFID's engagement in Zimbabwe? DFID's contribution is around £86 million a year. In earlier evidence, you've highlighted in particular some of the challenges in rural areas, particularly around health and education. Do you have a view about how broader sort of aid programming going forward should work in Zimbabwe, and in particular the policy of not channeling money through the Zimbabwean government? Do you think that's the right policy or something that should be reconsidered? I'll give each of you a brief opportunity to answer it. Do you want to go first, Professor Chikudu?
Sure. Well, I'll talk a little bit about medicine and public health, and a little bit about urban areas, because I don't work in rural areas as such. I think that particularly in public health, if we take the example, for instance, of the 2008 and 2009 cholera outbreak, which was one of the worst in African history, but itself was borne out in part by the collapse of the health system. Much of the work that I've done shows that donors working, say, in parallel streams and funding health programs through the kind of myriad host of different kinds of NGOs and humanitarian organizations is not always the most effective strategy for a coherent public health agenda. In part, the priorities are not streamlined and are not streamlined together. There is a lot of fragmentation of services, and I think particularly in a country where you have kind of complex and multiple epidemiological crises happening together, there is such a critical need for joined-up thinking. And so I think that we need to think of the Zimbabwean government, I guess, as a more complex entity. Mm-hmm. Technical ministries like the Ministry of Health are in fact extremely good at what they do. Many of the civil servants and high-ranking bureaucrats have a very clear vision and an astute political awareness of what's happening in the country and how they can work in collaborative fashion with partner agencies. But they also feel that they are usurped, undermined and belittled when they are undercapacitated and when everything is working through these parallel streams. Right. So my view quite strongly is that donor strategies for engagement can't treat the government as a single entity, and certainly ministries like the Ministry of Health are worth working with. The sort of final point that I'd make is particularly about urban areas where we've been seeing some of the worst protests. And in part, of course, because these are questions of livelihood and poverty, but they're also questions of just the social conditions of everyday existence. If you consider the fact that there has been an enduring water crisis now for nearly 20 years, we have an anachronistic water supply system that hasn't really been properly updated since about the 1950s. It is not fit for purpose. There is the regular bursting of sewage pipes that cross-contaminate with the water delivery system. At the moment, many donor agencies have been working to increase boreholes and tanks to have bowsers coming in, bringing in water. But these are short-term solutions that don't change the fundamental and underlying infrastructure. And I think to be able to do that does entail partnering now with ministries of local government, with Ministry of Water and so forth. And I think that would actually make a big difference in terms of feeling like that communities are seeing some improvement, that they have access to water, that their housing can be improved and so forth. And hopefully that can also mitigate against some of the demolition exercises that are carried out for much more political motivations. So certainly to treat the Zimbabwean government as a much more complex entity and to work strategically through certain ministries and at fundamental levels.
Thank you very much, Professor Alexander.
I want to wholly endorse everything my colleague has just said. I think those are incredibly important points, not to reduce the Zimbabwean government to some kind of homogenous entity. It is very diverse, and there are very, very many well-intentioned professionals working within ministries who would make excellent partners for interventions that will have life-changing effects. I think we've talked about health, we've talked about education. I think water infrastructure is incredibly important, and not just in Harare. Bulawayo is now suffering a crisis, which is basically down to spare parts, and it's having a huge effect on the entire city. Aid in those kinds of areas would make a big difference. But if I could just move on to some other areas, very briefly, because we haven't really talked about it yet. We can talk about this as a series of economic problems or a series of technical fixes, but there's obviously a much bigger political issue here. And how do donor agencies engage with that? I think you have to, in the current context, admit that we need to support organizations that are working around civil rights.
Yes.
Obviously, the Zimbabwe Association of Doctors for Human Rights, Zimbabwe Lawyers for Human Rights have been doing extraordinary work on shoestring budgets in the current context. Those kinds of organizations which are highly accountable, which are extremely well run, which have a long track record of excellent work. Those kinds of organizations deserve support and will make a real difference to the defense of a sense of citizenship in Zimbabwe. And I think a related area, again, very, very quickly, is that there needs to be, there's a constant call now everywhere around Zimbabwe for dialogue. I think probably the area where dialogue is not going to work is where everyone's talking about, which is between the two main parties. I just don't think there's any basic conditions for them to be talking constructively to each other at the moment. But there are many, many other areas where you can have constructive conversations, and those are at local levels, run by NGOs, run by chiefs, run by the National Peace and Reconciliation Commission. They're doing excellent work. all of that needs basic, small kinds of funding for transport, for tea, for that kind of thing. You can make a real difference by supporting those sorts of endeavors. The second area is at the regional level. SADC is absolutely crucial to coming to some kind of resolution in Zimbabwe, and there's been a total dropping of the ball on facilitating regional discussions that challenge the kind of political discourse coming out of Zimbabwe, and that needs to be done if there's going to be support for constructive intervention in Zimbabwe.
Professor Chan.
Just very quickly, just reiterate my broad point about international donor cooperation, and I do mean that in a number of sectors. We can't do it by ourselves. 2 quick wins. I do think the discretionary budgets of both the British ambassador and the different representative need to be increased, so they've got a freer hand to be more flexible in the dispersal of funds. And the third very, very quick win point, pharmaceuticals. I've seen people dying in hospitals of cancer, being treated by paracetamol because there's no palliative agents available. So the one thing that would be a huge quick win, huge public relations for us, but also a huge benefit for suffering patients is precisely in the area of providing pharmaceuticals.
Can I say a big thank you to the three of you for your evidence here this morning. I think we've covered a lot of ground in 45 minutes, and please feel free to stay if you wish to hear the Minister. Thank you very much indeed. I can invite the Minister to join us. Being with us today, Minister. We've seeking to cover 8 areas over the 45 minutes or so that we have with you. Let me kick off and ask, what messages have the British government give to the Zimbabwean government about its response to the recent protests?
Thank you very much, Chair. And can I also introduce Annabel Jerry, who is head of DFID in Zimbabwe, just happened to be in the UK, and I thought it was a wonderful opportunity for the committee to hear from her firsthand. So in response to what has clearly been a disproportionate use of force by security forces to the protests that arose in mid-January, to the hike in petrol prices, I summoned the Zimbabwe ambassador here in the UK to give him a formal message to take back to his government about the fact that we deplored this disproportionate violence from security forces, and I think there have been some very credible and very well documented cases of completely disproportionate violations. So the first thing I did was summon the ambassador. Following that, I also had the opportunity, because I was at the EU-AU foreign ministers meeting, to raise the situation with the Commissioner for Peace and Security of the African Union, who agreed that the African Union was very concerned about the deteriorating situation on the ground in Zimbabwe. Then further to that, I took a call from at his request from the Zimbabwean foreign minister to again reiterate those messages, outline the UK's concerns, and to emphasise that the messages, once I think that the President had returned to Zimbabwe, the messages that he was giving publicly needed to be followed through by actions. The Foreign Secretary also put out a message saying that he did not want to see a return to the past, and that we needed to see implementation of the various announcements that the President himself had made about the course of action that he wanted his government to follow in response to these disproportionate responses. Then I was in South Africa last week, so I was able to discuss the situation in Zimbabwe with both the South African government, and then I went on to Mozambique and was able to discuss it with the Mozambican foreign minister. The value of that, of course, is that they're both Commonwealth allies and neighbours, and take incredible interest, have very good links into the government. And so we think that South Africa in particular, which has just taken its seat on the Security Council, can play an important leading role in terms of engaging with the government, how it can ensure that the army basically gets back into barracks, and that the courts and the constitutional organisations of Zimbabwe take it forward in terms of the justice and the rule of law against these egregious violations.
Thank you for that, and I think we will all welcome those actions and those messages. Any indication that they're being listened to?
Well, I think we certainly think they're being heard. I would say that in terms of response through action, it's less clear that it is being followed through. I mean, there's certainly an uneasy calm has now returned to Zimbabwe, but I do think the messages are being heard. And so the question now is, I think, what the government can do to actually take forward the steps that they themselves have outlined that they want to do. And one of the key things that we would be keen to see is the violence that occurred right after the election on the 1st of August when protesters were shot using live ammunition. The Commission published its response just before Christmas, and the government has to respond to those Commission recommendations. I think the recommendations that the Commission made were sensible, and certainly implementing those would show very good faith, I think, in terms of the kind of steps that the government needs to do to address what happened.
Thank you. Richard.
The last time this committee systematically looked at Zimbabwe was quite a long time ago. It was 2009-10. And I think I'm the only survivor of the committee in those days. But at that time, the scene was at least cautiously optimistic. There was some kind of power sharing going on. Morgan Tsvangirai was in the government. And whilst we were not even then channeling aid through the government, there was a fair bit of technical assistance going in through the Prime Minister's office, and some support for non-ZANU-PF ministries at the time. Now, obviously, things have changed quite a lot since then. Progress stalled. And, I mean, my question to you this time is, what should we be doing now? How can we avoid getting caught up in another cycle of raised expectations, which are then dashed? And is there some merit, as we heard in the previous panel, of not seeing the government as a homogeneous entity, but actually differentiating between different departments, who's heading them up and what they're doing?
Well, can I start by saying that when I visited Zimbabwe a year ago, the message that I took to them was that they needed to have free, fair and peaceful elections. We believe that it is for the people of Zimbabwe to choose who their government are and who their representatives are in Parliament. But I announced on that visit a further £5 million of support for civil society organisations. I think during the course of today I may get some more questions on that, so I think it's probably worth getting out the way straight off the bat that we believe it's quite sensitive work, and we are not really able to disclose who it is that we work with and who we fund. And I hope the committee will respect, to some extent, that confidentiality. And that, in and of itself, will give the committee a sense of how carefully we have to step here. I think that throughout the Mugabe years, the UK has been a firm friend of the people of Zimbabwe, and through a range of programming have tried through very difficult economic and political circumstances to be on the side of the people through delivering a range of different interventions that alleviate extreme poverty. And so that's been the way in which we've tried to approach this whole situation. And so through thick and thin, we intend to continue with the work that we do through the Department for International Development to tackle the drivers of extreme poverty in a country which, by rights, it should be a lot better off than it is today.
Yeah, and I'm sure we do understand the sensitivity around some of the funding streams to parts of the NGO sector and so on. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is what kind of engagement with the government actually would work now to, on the one hand, try to identify that it's not just one body with one way of doing things, but at the same time to avoid just raising expectations when the problems you identified are clearly still there.
Yeah. Well, I think our view is that it is right to engage in terms of the messaging and to set out the kinds of reforms that would enable Western democracies and organisations to work more closely with tackling the government's outstanding international debt. But I think we're a long way from that, and we've gone further away from that as a result of the recent human rights violations by security forces. And I think that, clearly we have a range of people within the government that we speak to, but we don't fund any programs directly through the government. We work with primarily UN-led agencies to deliver the work that we do within country. There are one or two instances where we're providing some technical support, where we would fund an individual to go in and give advice. Annabelle, you may want to elaborate more on the specific current examples that we can speak to of the kind of technical support that we will be funding.
Thank you, Ms. So yes, we do have a differentiated relationship with the government. What we've done even through the Mugabe years was really to focus on areas where we agreed. So we agreed about girls' education, we agreed about extending healthcare. So with those health and education ministries, we have relationships at all levels technically. And in the way we deliver, because of risks really in terms of the way we have the partnership principles assessment, which you might be familiar with, where we look at government's commitments to human rights, to public financial management, anti-corruption, democratic accountability, and also on poverty reduction. That really determines with DIPIC corporately whether we give money to or work in parallel. And from that assessment, we've consistently assessed that the commitment is not fully there, hasn't been fully there, so we've worked in parallel. But that hasn't prevented us, where it's made sense, to do some small funding indirectly, as the Minister said, through UNICEF. So, for example, if we're teaching teachers on the new curriculum or nurses in emergency obstetric care, then they can get paid, but doesn't go through the government, it would go through the UN to those teachers. Similarly, schools, the poorest schools in the poorest areas who have very small grants to help them meet the very, very basic standards to provide an education for children, goes to the schools, but again through UNICEF, each time carefully accounted for. So those are the sorts of examples. Another one would be in rural water, where we had to use a government agency for drilling boreholes, because that was cheaper and more cost effective to do it that way. But all of those cases are agreed specifically with ministers in each instance.
Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Nigel.
Minister, May last year, President Mnangagwa applied to rejoin the Commonwealth. And the then Foreign Secretary said this is brilliant news. In light of what's happened in Zimbabwe since, do we still think it's brilliant news?
Well, we certainly always, whichever country is interested in talking to the Commonwealth Secretariat, who obviously are responsible for these applications, we welcome any country that wants to go on the path where they might meet the kind of democratic and human rights values that the Commonwealth stands for. And so clearly in terms of Zimbabwe writing a letter to the Commonwealth Secretariat, as with many other countries, that would always be a path that we would welcome. I would say that the UK as one of the members of the Commonwealth. Clearly, it would have to be a unanimous decision by all 53 members, but as of today, the UK would not be able to support that application because we don't believe that the kind of human rights violations that we're seeing from security forces in Zimbabwe are the kind of behaviour that you would need to see from a Commonwealth member. And that's where I think that both South Africa and Mozambique, as Commonwealth neighbours in Southern Africa and Botswana and Namibia, so all the Southern African countries, are very well placed to be able to give guidance and support to the outlined ambitions of the Zimbabwe government, which clearly, as of today, they would not be meeting in the UK's view.
And would we be willing to financially support those countries in supporting Zimbabwe to get to the democratic norms that we respect and believe are sufficient for them to then properly rejoin the Commonwealth?
Well, when I was in South Africa, and who are, I think, keen to sort of be in the lead on this, I indicated that we would be very keen to hear from the southern area countries, what their plans were to take things forward. And we would be very open-minded about listening to those plans, but we would see them as very much being able to take the lead on this.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. Pauline?
You talked about human rights, and Zimbabwe remains one of the FCO's human rights priority countries, and senior leadership figures remain subject to the EU and US sanctions.
Yes.
Given these facts and the recent alarming developments, was HMG too quick to back the current president?
Well, I'll talk about sanctions in a minute, but I do want to make it very clear to the committee that the message that I took to the government when I travelled out to Zimbabwe last year was one of saying that we want to back free and fair peaceful elections, that it's for the people of Zimbabwe to decide who their government is. And so the announcement that we made when I went out there was for additional funding to civil society organisations. And both the former Foreign Secretary and myself met with the leader of the opposition, Nelson Chamisa, in the run-up to the elections when he was in the UK. And we believe that it's entirely something for the people of Zimbabwe to decide. Specifically with regard to sanctions, the committee is probably aware that the process of rolling over the sanctions, the EU sanctions, has just come up. And the UK has been arguing that it is not yet time for us to allow those to expire. And I think since the recent developments, our case will be that actually we think there might be a case for widening it to include further individuals. We have been aware that the President has said that heads will roll. We haven't yet seen any specific heads rolling, but that might be a good example of the kinds of people who could then be further extended and we could include in the sanctions regime. I also think it's right because we do get some pushback on this from southern area neighbouring countries to point out that the sanctions that are in place are very targeted on specific individuals like Robert and Grace Mugabe, the Zimbabwe defence industries. They are not the kind of sanctions that have a widespread economic impact. The difficulty that the Zimbabwe economy is in is not due to sanctions, which are due very, very targeted. So I think that's worth stressing.
Thank you. If we could go from FCO to DFID.
Do you mind if I just follow up on sanctions before you move on to the other area? Our three academic witnesses were unanimous in saying that they felt the sanctions were politically counterproductive, and they cited some of the evidence of surrounding countries, but also within the country, that actually sanctions are used politically by the regime, and that in a sense outweighs any advantage they might have. Is that a consideration as the UK approaches EU discussions on the future of sanctions?
So your previous panel argued that sanctions were being used as an excuse to prevent...
That's essential, although they may well be targeted as you've described. In practice, people in the country don't believe that, because what they're told by the government is this is the evil West having a go at us, and that has some resonance.
And
therefore, politically, it isn't helpful to a process of getting the government to open up. I hope I've characterised the evidence correctly. They're nodding, so yeah.
No, I would strongly push back on that. I think they are very targeted and very specific on certain individuals. And I also think that, particularly where with the US ZDERA Act, which is also, again, targeted on specific organisations and individuals, but has enacted in it that the kind of political reforms that would be helpful to taking that those sanctions off are very clear, and there's specific legislation to do with opening up political space within Zimbabwe, to do with opening up the civil society that can easily be taken forward by the government of Zimbabwe and would be very low cost. So actually I think it is helpful, and it sets out to the government of Zimbabwe the very low cost legislative track that they could follow, that then would, provided it was then also observed by the government, lead to the US being able to repeal the ZDERA.
Richard, and then I'll come back to Pauline.
Thanks. That's what sanctions, progress in areas like that are what sanctions are meant to achieve. Have they been achieving any demonstrable impact, and if so, what?
Well, the demonstrable impact is that the government has committed to doing these legislative changes. So, they know what needs to happen, but it hasn't actually happened. So, from that point of view, I suppose you could say that the demonstrable impact is that the government of Zimbabwe is aware of what it needs to do.
Pauline.
Yes, if we go on to DFID's side, women in Zimbabwe experience horrific sexual violence and in the country at the moment. What more can DFID do to help those particularly vulnerable women?
Yes, I think the committee should feel reassured that we do have a lot of programming in this particular area. And again, I'm sure the committee would be very sensitive to the fact that what we do and who we work with, again, is something that we have to be very careful about. But when I was in Zimbabwe last year, I did go and visit one of the safe houses, for example, that we fund within Harare, and see the work that is being done with vulnerable young women who have had to flee sexual violence. I think we do a lot in terms of the judicial process and supporting some of that. But I think especially since the really quite sickening reports that we've seen recently, where, can you imagine a situation where you're not only a victim of sexual violence, but you also cannot go to the authorities because it's the authorities themselves that are perpetrating? I mean, it just defies imagination actually as to how horrific the situation is. So the team is looking at ways in which we could further support victims in a way that would give them further psychosocial support and assistance. And I'm going to bring in Annabelle in a moment to sort of elaborate a bit further on this. But from our point of view, we do think that the recent, because I met with members of Zimbabwean civil society who travelled, some of them, to meet with me when I was in South Africa last week, and I just think that in terms of some of the reports that we've had, it's been women who are associated with some of the opposition who have been specifically targeted here. I mean, these are just completely egregious human rights violations, and so I do want to make sure that whatever the UK can do to support those victims, to work with civil society to try and address some of those norms, is something that we really should be leading on. And Annabelle, can you just sort of talk a little bit more about some of the current programming we're doing, some of your things?
Could you also address, you said you went to a safe house. That won't accommodate many people, many women. How many safe houses are we supporting? And are there any outside of Harare? Yes. It isn't only in Harare that this is happening.
There are, and I'm going to bring in Annabelle to talk through the details because she will have seen more of them at first hand than I have.
Thank you. So in the current situation, it's been shelter that we've been providing through NGOs. Counselling as well has been important, case management, in some cases legal representation as well, medical services too. Yes, there's the Safe House at the Ministry visited in Harare, but we have also across the country. In the past, we supported through the UN, UNFPA and UNICEF, Sexual and Reproductive Health Rights Programme, quite a large one. So across the country, there are a network of places where people have been able to go over a number of years, and we've worked with the police, the local legal authorities to try and fast-track victims of abuse in a way that's sensitive and protects them. We've also had for a number of years in our social protection programme, a big part of that is case management in terms of children's protection cases. Levels of violence against children are high, also against women. So we've supported nearly 3,000 children through the case management system with access to justice. Right now, there's a new programme actually starting this week on medical and psychosocial support. It's through something called the START Fund, which you will have heard of, which we co-fund, and that's been mobilised by 2 international NGOs, really recognising the fact that there aren't enough medical or psychosocial services for people who've been affected by the events of January. And then the other thing that we're doing is we're starting a new programme calling it Stopping Abuse and Female Exploitation, which will be quite a large programme, which will be working on how do you start to tackle this. Because what we've found is, although we have gender very strongly across our programmes, health, education, that when you get to these kinds of really difficult issues, you only skim the surface. So we need to have a really targeted approach. So I think that will also help us, as well as to really understand what's going on in communities, do learning about what's going to be more and less effective across the country to start to really break into a very horrible situation for young women and girls.
Thank you.
UK has supported Zimbabwe in its efforts to get on IMF program so that it can start clearing its debts to international financial institutions. What are the next steps for all the stakeholders on this issue?
Well, this is a difficult one because I think we can all see that there needs to be progress in terms of the arrears that Zimbabwe has to all of the international financial institutions, and the recent violence from state actors makes it very difficult for me personally to try and argue that this is the time for the UK to be stepping up to the plate and working with international partners to do this. So I think that for progress to be made, progress is going to have to happen in terms of political reform in Zimbabwe. The idea that we would now step up to the plate and say, look guys, the government's doing this to its own citizens, shooting them with live ammunition, a range of other egregious violations, and you know what, the UK is really happy to be arguing that now's the time for them to be helped by the international community with their arrears. You may push back on me on this, but I find that a very difficult political case to make. I know that from my conversations in South Africa last week, that the South Africans have also been looking at ways in which they might take a lead in terms of putting together a package of international support. And as I said in response to earlier questions, we will certainly listen to that case and listen to that plan. But I certainly, as the UK government's Minister for Africa, am not going to say that now's the time for us to really be sticking our necks out politically on the back of the kind of behaviour that we've seen from the government.
Chris.
Thank you, Chair. DFID continues not to channel funds directly through the Zimbabwean government. And we were actually hearing from our experts on the panel earlier about some of the effects. Teachers can't turn up to work because they can't afford fuel to get there, or the transportation, or indeed run the schools, and indeed the hospitals, a lack of medications. I wanted to know if this is going to remain the principle for DFID in the future, or this might come under review, and if so, what criteria, benchmarks might be used for making such a decision?
Yes, so it's been a very long time since we have funded the government's programmes directly. There are very few countries in the world where we do so, and I can't see that being something that will change any time in the immediate future. But you might want to push back on me, Annabelle, there. No. We would need to see considerable progress, not only in terms of economic reform, political reform, but also the committee will be aware that the Anti-Corruption Commission, for example, was disbanded. We're waiting to see who the new appointees. The previous one had obviously been very ineffective, so it may be that we will see some good appointments to that. But a range of different things, and it will be a number of years before I think we're even in a position to consider, and that's if all of the right political and economic reforms are made. But you can see examples of where that has happened in the world.
I mean, we're hearing examples, for example, the Ministry of Health is very well organised. You've got very excellent professionals doing the very best they can with very extremely limited resources. Would that be an area, for example, that you might consider?
Well, I think it would be very difficult at the moment. Obviously, there are occasionally ones that I get to have to sign off on, on a case-by-case basis. So there is a process where the team can come to me and I can give a ministerial sort of sign-off on expenditure through government departments. Annabelle, do you want to elaborate more on where you think it might be something you would be coming to me on that?
Thank you. So really what we're doing at the moment is we're very, very mindful of not getting into a situation where we take the government of Zimbabwe off the hook for what it is supposed to do. And after the crisis of 2008, we ended up paying, for example, top-ups to essential health workers. And it took us years and years and years to get out of that situation. Paying school fees was another thing. Again, it took us years and years to get out of that situation. Now, at the time, that was what we did in order to get through a bad situation, but it didn't actually help the government to take responsibility for how it managed its budgets, to make sure it allocated out of its scarce resources. So the kind of conversation that we've had in the last time that we did this, that I was there, was just before Christmas, is to look at how can donor funds come in, complement government funds. So an area is drugs. So we are really worried about essential drugs running out. So we already provide a certain amount of essential drugs. So they're bought by international donors and then they're supplied using the government system, but they're not given to the government. And this is an area where, because we can access foreign currency and the government is finding it harder and harder, that's the kind of area that we'll be looking at in the coming months to say, well, could we put more into that area for a finite period? Because obviously it's in no one's interest for people to be dying because there aren't drugs that they can afford. So those are the kind of judgments that we'll be needing to make, and consulting the Minister, obviously.
And from the evidence we took from the academics, that sounds like an urgent priority, that issue of drugs. So is there an urgency in terms of seeking to expand that programme, I guess, so that it can meet the higher level of need?
Yes, that's something that we have discussed with the Minister of Health and with the donor community, so it's ongoing, really looking at what's the best way to respond to an urgent need. And for example, with the cholera outbreak, we were able to very quickly come in there with additional vaccinations, oral vaccinations through Gavi. That was done very, very fast. We work with the World Health Organization on disease outbreaks. We put more money into that to provide an immediate surge, but as the academic said before, this is going to be a long-term thing, and we have to balance the immediate needs and thinking about long-term support that's required.
Can I just ask, sorry, Chris, on education, you mentioned sort of learning from what was done in 2008 and the paying of school fees and the approach now. I mean, we looked at education as part of a general inquiry into DFID's work globally, and we looked at a number of African countries. I mean, how would the sort of work you do to support education in Zimbabwe be different because of the political context compared to, say, Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria?
I suppose at the most basic level, there are things like government financing for education, which is a bit more in balance than some of those other countries. In Zimbabwe, over 90% of the budget goes on teachers. And there's a massive inequity between areas which are richer and areas which are poorer. In the richer areas, the parents pay a lot more, they contribute, learning outcomes are better. The poorer areas, that doesn't happen. Children don't go to school for all reasons of poverty. So looking at things like education financing at a quite basic level. What we're also doing in Zimbabwe, and the academics mentioned it earlier, is girls' education. We have quite a large investment in girls' education, and really getting at this issue of keeping girls in secondary school so that they're up to their O-levels, they get a qualification. And then also supporting those girls, because mostly they're orphans or maybe they're carers for other young children, with microfinance, with training, so that they can actually then make a successful transition into adulthood, because we recognise they remain vulnerable even if they've got a few qualifications. So that's going to remain a strong kind of emphasis for us in Zimbabwe.
Thank you. Sorry, Chris, I interrupted.
Yeah, no, it's fine. The 4-year Zimbabwe Economic Stability and Transformative Programme began last March, but there's very little public details about it. Can you tell me a little bit about it and what it involves?
Yes. We've disbursed, I think, £2 million of that programme in the first year. That's been to the World Bank's sort of ZimRef multi-donor trust fund, and that's been the expenditure so far, and that has been specifically used in terms of technical advice, bringing in an expert or two, very minimal deployment so far of that particular stream of funding. Annabelle, do you have any more specific details on what the 2 million was? Yeah.
So looking at investment laws has been one area. Companies laws. So one of the issues, as in many African countries, about corporate governance, transparency around company ownership. So company law, procurement, and legislation and procedures around public procurement, all of which help the environment for the economy and for businesses to invest. State-owned enterprises has been an area as well, looking at the need to reform, and we heard earlier about some of the political tensions there. On the one hand, the understanding that these are draining the fiscus, on the other hand, the political difficulty about actually acting on that. So those are some of the areas. Also improving poverty data, funding a poverty survey. It's been something we've done. And for the rest of the programme, that's really, we're going to have a discussion with the Minister now about that. But at the time we started that was on the change of government, and a government that was interested in opening the economy up. And definitely needs a lot of advice as to how to do that, a lot of help as to how to do that. But the question we now have to just have with the Minister is what's the most appropriate thing to do on that. Now, the need is still there. The private sector is desperate for the opportunity to actually operate normally, have access to the currency it needs to create jobs, and all of that need is still there. But the question is how best to support that now.
And also, I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about the role of the Geneva Centre for the Democratic Control of the Armed Forces, which is long, if nothing else, which is one of the participating organisations. What's it doing in the context of this project?
Yeah. So on that one member of their scoping team came from their International Security Sector Advisory Team, which is part of the organisation mentioned, and was contracted under the programme to assess the economic aspects and non-state actors. So I'm sure we would be very happy to share her report with the committee.
Please, thank you. Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Chris. Paul.
Thank you very much. Minister, before the elections in May 2018, CDC announced that it would support loans worth up to $100 million to the government, to the Zimbabwean government. So 6 months on, or so, what concrete results have flowed from that initiative?
Yes, so this is a great example of showing how incredibly difficult the situation is with, the committee is probably going to get onto the issues around the exchange rate. So the big problem for Zimbabwe is earning enough foreign exchange, and for businesses within Zimbabwe to earn enough foreign exchange. And the challenge so far has proved so great that with that particular programme, that was announced independently of the UK government, there has, I think, been one viable company that's been able to come forward with a reasonable application that has not yet actually been disbursed. So nothing from what could potentially be a great source of funding for the private sector in Zimbabwe has been viable, given the very difficult situation with regard to companies earning foreign exchange and the different exchange rates that operate within the economy.
Does that mean there's no further actions planned at the moment for from CDC, or
well, they have a better fund. So they've got one called Takura, which is an equity fund, and I met with the head of CDC in South Africa last week, and they have been more successful with that, and it's got a focus not just on Zimbabwe but also on the rest of the region. And I think they're planning to actually put another $25 million into that. So that one's been a bit more successful, but with the loan fund, because of the need to generate foreign currency to service those external debts, they've not seen anything that is viable at the kind of exchange rates that are existing within the Zimbabwe economy.
Great, thank you very much.
And is there scope then to make a shift? So if the more traditional way that CDC operates may not be suitable for the current economic situation in Zimbabwe, but do you call it the Takura fund? Is it possible to capitalise that a bit more, or is it?
There is a potential $25 million that they have lined up to go into that, and that is the more traditional way that CDC operates, with patient capital effectively. And so the 100 million fund that Paul was mentioning, that's more a loan fund that's in association with Standard Chartered, and I think Standard Chartered, and I think they've done 60-40 on that. And because it's a loan repayment, obviously that makes it difficult. But with the Takura funds, that's more of an equity investment, and so they can. I think they've got a further 25 million that they would be prepared to deploy in that.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we've completed our questions. I don't think colleagues have any final. So thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure.
Thank you for the evidence today. Order.
The proceeding has ended.